typography poster this week, I want you to think about a couple things. So first off, it doesn't matter whether your poster is using more of a handwritten or script font, or using more of a serif, or you're using a sans serif. What the goal here is that you're playing with the typography. So one thing that both of these are doing well is that it's not just the type written out line 1, line 2, line 3. They're playing with how the type intersects together in the case of this one, or how the actual letter forms are intersecting with this one. And both of these are working well in terms of making the type something more than just letters. They're turning it into a bit of a graphic. Something like this is less, I would say, like graphic of the text, but what it is very clear to see. Play at your own risk is the title or the call to action or the headline, and then down here is essentially the information they want you to do something with. So if this was, you wanted people to then remember to do something, this would be where that information would go. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about, like, what is your header, and then what do you want people to do, and make sure that both of those elements are on your poster. It's helpful to think about how you can use grids and guides for this. So this is an example of grids and guides that are diagonal as opposed to using more of a modular grid or some other system. You can use whatever you would like, but you should be using a grid system for this assignment. And it can be something that you're playing with the typography in terms of, here you're playing with kind of cutting off letter forms and really structuring that grid in a way that it's still legible, but how do you explore it? Or how do you play with the letter forms and still make them very legible, but that you have on these extra elements that are helping bring your attention to the words themselves. You can also play with how the words are shown. So for example, Paula Scher is a very famous designer, and this is her typography. So this is kind of a play on how do you use those colors to basically show something else. So this is Paula Scher, and then her typography is a separate idea. They're playing with a grid system here. So here, this is essentially 2 columns, and this ampersand is taking up 2 columns as well as this column of text. They do have justified text, but as you can look at here, the spacing is very consistent, so you want to be very cautious that if you do something like this, you are being very conscientious about that spacing. Otherwise, you can use something like this, where you don't have justified text, but you want to be cautious about the rag. So here, this rag is really forming a shape. We probably want to adjust that a bit more. But here you have the headline, and then this would be the call to action, which in this case is, hey, go to this university. But ultimately, you want to make sure that you're thinking about what that call to action would be for your specific one. So one thing that Paula Scher's poster is doing really well is that the her makes sense, right? It's both her name and then her typography. What you don't want to do is do something like this, where the colors don't make sense. And ultimately what it does is it just causes someone to stare at this and be very confused as to why you're using this approach. So you want to make sure that if you're using that idea of the different colored text to pull attention, different weighted text, different styled text, that there's a message behind it, that it makes sense, or that you're thinking about crafting it as like A-B repetition. So you can also do something like that. It doesn't have to be that you have the secret message inside, but that ultimately you are thinking through how do you showcase your idea in the way that makes the most sense. What you cannot do for this assignment is turn your text into an object. So here, first off, this isn't a headline and there is no call to action, and you're forming a light bulb. And so the space between the letter forms actually don't really make much sense. The grid that you're using doesn't really exist. The hierarchy of information isn't super clear. And so this is aligning all of its eggs into the bucket of the light bulb, which we don't want to do. Same thing here. You're using the hand to be the driving force. So what we want to do is have the typography be the driving force, not an object that you're making out of typography. And something like this could be a very strong design, but you still want to think through all those things that we've talked about thus far. So you want to think about using spacing effectively. So here, us and us are touching. The space between the leading is sometimes consistent and sometimes not, and sometimes it's very large and sometimes it's very small. So you want to make sure that you're thinking through all those elements, that you're thinking about your your legibility. So here, this is quite a difficult typeface to read, and it doesn't really pair very well with the typeface that they've used for the main quote. So making sure that you're thinking about the pairing of the typeface, you're thinking about legibility, you're thinking about your accessibility, and make sure that you have enough background and foreground contrast for that to be legible. And most off, think about how you can use the type to be a design element. So thinking about how this is a design, this is a design, this is a design, but ultimately you don't want to use it to like create text boxes, like a cell phone text or something that's, you're thinking about legibility, you're thinking about your accessibility, and make sure that you have enough background and foreground contrast for that to be legible. And most off, think about how you can use the type to be a design element. So thinking about how this is a design, this is a design, this is a design, but ultimately you don't want to use it to like create text boxes, like a cell phone text or something that's making a shape like this, because ultimately that's relying then on the illustration as opposed to the typography decision.